All right. Hey, everybody. It's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show, brought to you, as always, by Skeptic Magazine. Here's our latest issue. Hey, check it out. Crime and Punishment. Yeah, beautiful. If you haven't seen the magazine, it's 4-color throughout. Beautifully done in print. We had a redesign a few years ago. I know there's a lot of online magazines out there, and we are also online, just like them, but we also have in print. And we keep our issues in print all the way back to 1992. You can get the one with Isaac Asimov on the cover, Volume 1, Number 1. So go to skeptic.com/magazine to order a subscription, digital or print, and any back issues you want. It's super cool. Oh, by the way, we also have a new web page design. We're finally out of the 90s and into the 2020s. So here we have this beautiful new design. That's my last podcast guest. And you scroll through. It's very much like the Free Press and some of the other, Quillette and some of the other online digital magazines as well. But anyway, okay, enough of the commercial. My guest today, returning champion, Katherine Stewart. She's the author of The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, which she was on for a couple of years ago. The award-winning book upon which the documentary feature, God and Country, produced by Rob Reiner, is based. I watched that. It's really good. I think it's on Netflix, right? Or is it Amazon Prime? Anyway, I saw it somewhere there. You can find it there. Right. God and Country. That's the one, right? Okay. And her work, she's been tracking this community for the last 15 years. Her first book on this in 2012, The Good News Club, covered the religious right's efforts to infiltrate and undermine public education. Here's the new book, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Hey, I just looked up on the New York Times bestseller list. You're on there.
This is true.
Oh, my God. How exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
First week.
I was hoping that when the book came out, it would seem a little less timely and people would say, what are you talking about? Or it's taking a different direction. But unfortunately, that's not the case. I mean, it may be good for book sales, but I don't think it's good for the rest of us.
Yeah. Well, let's get into that. So would you say, I mean, I read the two books, the last one and this one on audio. I didn't read the Good News Club. Is this something like a trilogy? And this is the third volume, or how would you describe it?
It really did. It is a trilogy. And, you know, it all started 16 years ago here in Santa Barbara when a program that aims to indoctrinate kids as young as 5 into a very reactionary form of the Christian religion showed up at the Cold Spring School, our daughter's public elementary school, which you're familiar with. The program confuses very little kids into thinking their public school endorses a very particular form of religion because public schools have a cloak of authority in the minds of young kids especially. They think that's taught in their school, that's what their school wants them to believe. And, you know, the leaders of this organization were offered free and better space in the evangelical church next door to the school. But they declined and they insisted on being in the school. So what I saw then, frankly, didn't make any sense. Why were they forcing their way into our kids' public elementary school? The movement, I could see I started to investigate the legal strategy that had allowed these types of programs to be placed in public schools, public elementary schools, you know, in the first place. And I was able to recognize that really it was a consequence of a 15-year plus strategy on the part of the right-wing legal movement to bring the right cases to the right courts in order to achieve a big win that was going to seriously degrade the separation of church and state. So that's really the kind of incident that got me following down this path. And Money, Lies, and God is my third book on the topic. From the beginning, I recognized that, you know, this program was just one small part of a much larger war on public education. And, you know, they had a lot of hostility to public schools. But I soon recognized that the war on public education was really just one small part of a larger battle against America as a modern constitutional democracy.
That's good. That particular school, you said it's a public school.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, there's pretty strict laws about that. You can't introduce any particular religion to the children. How are they doing this?
Well, I encourage you to read my first book if you want to know about this. They call themselves they're an after-school club. But here's the thing about public. We're talking little kids here. Kids cannot make a distinction between takes place in their school and a program sponsored by their school. They think if it's happening in the public school, it has a sort of cloak of authority of the public school. I mean, as it stands, public schools can, and our school had the same issue. You can exclude an art club because it's too messy. Or you can exclude a martial arts club, which they tried to introduce into our school because, we don't want the kids learning to fight. But this group and the sort of legal advocacy sort of argument behind it says the one category of religion you cannot exclude is, the one category of, they call it just speech from a certain point of view. One category of speech you cannot exclude is religion. Otherwise, it's discrimination against their religious viewpoint. Begs the question, Michael, is religion just speech from a certain point of view? Well, not according to our tax code. Religions have special, unique privileges in our tax code. They can have parsonage exemptions. They don't have to open their books to the government to see how the taxpayer money is being spent. It's like a taxpayer subsidy. They also are exempt from anti-discrimination law. A kind of soccer club wouldn't really last very long in a public school setting. Elementary, mind you, elementary, we're talking K through 5. Like if they said, all the kids can play except the Jewish kids, like that really wouldn't work. You can't, or we're only allowed to have teachers who are members of Scientology, and no other teachers are allowed to play. Like you really wouldn't. Well, that's religion, so let's find another category. Only, I don't know, whatever, blue-eyed teachers, right? But these religious groups kind of want to have it both ways. They want their tax privileges and they want their anti-discrimination laws, but they also want to claim they're just sort of like everyone else in the public school setting. So I could see it's kind of an abstract legal argument, but I could see that this was like basically turning, this was an argument that was going to turn civil rights law on its head, and it was going to sideline the Establishment Clause, which it has.
Yeah. Well, my response to parents, who don't like public education or they want their kids to grow up with a certain religion is, fine, then go to public school. Then send your kid to a Christian school or a Jewish school or whatever. Why is that my problem? Well, because they want something else. They want, the vouchers or whatever, or they can't afford the private tuition or something like this. But there is also, I guess, maybe a deeper culture war issue there where, creationists, for example, are mostly Christians who are worried about atheism being taught in public schools, so that public education is not separated from religion. Atheism is a kind of religion, or humanism, and that's what's being taught to these kids.
Humanism in public schools, they teach reading and math.
Yes, I know, right?
We're public school parents. We've done different things. We actually homeschooled one of our kids for a period, not because the public schools were terrible, but just for other reasons. But, public schools are really held to very strict standards, and they got to get those reading and math scores up. So they teach state capitals, and they teach, in the downtime, kids are learning how to get along with other kids, including those who are different. But here's a movement that thinks anything that is not actively affirming to their worldview is somehow hostile to them. They don't accept the idea of religious neutrality, neither endorsing nor denigrating any particular form of religion.
Well, and from the school's perspective, private school's perspective, is something like school vouchers and school choice and all those things where the government money is still flowing somewhere. They see that they can get a piece of that, and that's why they promote that?
Well, I think the movement's aims are twofold. On the first, look, they called our children the harvest, and they called our public schools mission fields. And they have like a two-pronged strategy. The first is to force their programming into public schools, which we're seeing on steroids right now with all these 10 Commandments bills where you have to put 10 Commandments in every single public school classroom. And, Bible curricula that's been introduced in Texas where they're actually paying teachers, public elementary school teachers, extra to teach very young children a deeply sectarian Bible curricula during public school hours. It's like you've got on the chaplains and all this kind of stuff. So on the one hand, they want to force their programming into the public schools. And number two, they want to shrink public schools, defund it, and So the money, public money, taxpayer money, yours and mine, can flow to private religious schools that can teach creationism, contempt for kids who are different, and anything they want. And one of the ways that they do that is they're launching these sort of insane culture wars in the public schools, alleging that they're like gender change factories and that they're promoting critical race theory, which they don't do, in order to like foster mistrust in public education and soften the ground for wholesale assault, because they really don't like the idea of non-sectarian public education. They think if it's, listen, when I was researching my first book, I went to the National Convention of the Child Evangelism Fellowship. This was the group that was forcing its way into public elementary schools nationwide. And one of the speakers, a guy named Matt Staver, he's the president and co-founder of Liberty Counsel, which is a right-wing legal advocacy group. He said anything, I'm paraphrasing here, he said anything that fails to have Christ at the center is evil. So basically, any form of education that is not explicitly Christian in the way that he thinks Christianity should be, by the way, he'd probably look at the nice, church preschool that our kids went to as like demonic or satanic, right? But he was saying, anything that fails to affirm our viewpoint is demonic or satanic. So you have then groups like Moms for Liberty. You know what they are, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, I read your book.
Yeah,
but
not everybody does.
Yeah. Well, no, I read the whole thing on audio. Yeah, it's quite. The reader is quite good. But okay, just one more kind of general thought on this. Like I was just telling you off air here that I was at this debate in Austin with by the Free Press and Fire. Does the West need a religious revival? So, Ayaan Hirsi Ali's argument is that Christianity or Judeo-Christian worldview is sort of the operating system of the United States, and that even if you don't believe this specific thing here, whatever, just kind of in general. This is Ross Douthat's argument in his new book, To Believe. He was the other debate opponent there. That pick one. It doesn't really matter which one. Just have a worldview with rules and respect and dignity and some kind of foundation for morality and so on. And that's what makes the Western world better than other non-Western countries. So while they may agree with you on some of the specifics about schools or whatever, they would like to see kind of a general, it's almost like a collective action problem. How do we make America great again, whatever, make America better? We should teach foundational values. And who does that? Well, Christians do that pretty well. So let's kind of get that in there somewhere. I guess that would be their argument.
Oh my gosh. I mean, so much to say here. And then look what this has led to. It's led to the election of the most transparently amoral, lawless president I think that we've ever seen. I mean, they told us ahead of the election what they were going to do, smash the institutions of our democracy, or what they call the administrative state, which they see for ideological reasons as interfering with their agenda, smash the institutions like Medicare and Social Security that actually provide a social safety net that help with what one might think of as Christian values of helping the poor and the least of these. We've got a stream of transparently lawless executive orders. We've got a total weaponization of the Department of Justice to become like Trump's personal mob force, decapitation of the FBI, shuttering of foreign aid and the destruction of America's soft power. We've got an alliance with one of the most, Putin. How do you describe him? How do you describe a man who tolerates no freedom of speech, no political opposition in his own country, and hands off, he's like a kleptocrat, hands off pieces of his own country's wealth off to oligarchs who then buy a bunch of yachts and take all the money out of the country and leave a very sad economy? I mean, listen, democracy also requires a professional government staffed with individuals who are subject to ethics rules and constraints and act on the basis of reason and evidence in accordance with the law. And this is why leaders of the anti-democratic movement, who you're for whom your folks are driving support. I mean, listen, I've when I knew Ayan, she wasn't an autocrat at all, but there is a sector of the movement that actually derives benefit from this kind of idea of promoting Christianity as an official religion, where, in fact, America's origins are, frankly, heterodox, and I would argue heretical from the very beginning. The idea of America is founded in the notions of equality, rule of law, the idea that we should have policies that are debated in public and based on reason. We're not going to all agree on everything, but we need to be able to agree on certain facts in order to craft policies that are good compromises given the population and also best for our country. This is also a movement, Michael, that has gained political power by spreading the most toxic forms of disinformation and conspiracism. And it really doesn't, I think of this movement as frankly nihilistic, because it doesn't view facts as meaningful at all. It's declared an absolute war on the truth. Everything is performative. We can get everybody to believe the great replacement. We can get them focused on this sort of gender issue in order to distract from the larger contours of what we're doing. Whatever you think of those issues, they're a massive distraction. And, as you probably gathered from my chapter on Reawaken America, this movement really does spread the most noxious forms of conspiracism for politics and power. So you have to forgive my outburst a little bit. But this idea that, the sanctimonious folks are going to save our country by imposing their form of religion on an incredibly diverse country, a country that's diverse from the start, and actually has a real moral basis, the basis in the ideals of equality and justice and rule of law. It just doesn't fly for me.
Yeah. Well, just, my response to them on that was first, it's not like America is all of a sudden an atheistic hellhole. It's 75% of Americans are still churched. They still go to church regularly. It's only the nuns, the no religious affiliation is only 25% on average, probably 30 to 40% for millennials and less for boomers and so on. And also, the idea that atheism is growing, it has grown a lot, but it was so low. It was like 1 or 2%, right? So now it's maybe 9%, 10%, a few others, religious, but spiritual, but not religious, or agnostic, or, they follow Deepak Chopra or whatever, they're Western Buddhists. And even that, the people that say they believe in God with, high confidence, it went from 90% to 65, 70% or something like that. The majority of Americans are still deeply religious and go to church fairly regularly, especially if you compare it to Northern European countries, who, by the way, are doing quite well in terms of societal health. So apparently you don't need religion. So that was my, kind of response to that. And if you look at then the final thing on the Founding Fathers, if you just read what they themselves explain where they got their ideas from, it's all these, ancient Roman and Greek philosophers and Enlightenment, their colleagues really, of Hume and Locke and Rousseau, and the arguments for a republic as they designed it, came straight out of the Enlightenment. There's no discussion in there, but back in Leviticus it says here, so we should. Or you remember what Jesus said? There's nothing like that in the Federalist Papers and so on. That's all grafted on much later. Anyway, that was my response to that.
Well, you're singing my tune, so I like.
So let's separate Christianity from nationalism. You talk about Christian nationalism. So what percentage of Christians go in for Christian nationalism? What percentage of nationalists are using Christianity as a bulwark against non-nationalism or globalism or whatever?
Right. Well, listen, I'll explain something. I gave my last book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. I use the term religious nationalism to show that religious nationalism is something that happens to society, but doesn't necessarily start out as a political program endorsed by millions of members of the rank and file. So when you have a leader like Putin in Russia, or Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran, when they're binding themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in order to consolidate authoritarian power. We rightly recognize this as a form of religious nationalism. It's a sort of reactionary nationalism, this idea of who gets to properly belong in a country and who doesn't. So it divides the population into the in-group and the out-group, the pure versus the impure. And this is what autocrats do. They divide their countries, divide and conquer, and that helps maintain their lock on power. And that's exactly what leaders of the anti-democratic movement are doing today. It's divisive by design, because America will never be the Christian nation that they say they want. It will only be ever, if they succeed, a country in which one group imposes its illiberal values and laws on another group in society. And that sort of, when you look at like what religious nationalist leaders do, like Putin or Erdogan or leaders in Iran, you can call their countries theocracies in a certain fake sense, and that there's an official religion and their laws, depending on the, where, may be based more or less on their holy texts or on certain interpretations of their holy texts, but they're more accurately described as kleptocratic, cronyistic autocracies with absolute suppression of free speech and no tolerance for political opposition. And this is kind of where the current administration, this is what they're moving toward. Look at somebody like Kash Patel being tapped to lead the FBI with his enemies list, and his second in command is like he and his second in command, they're like absolute conspiracists. Kash Patel has spoken at the Reawaken America tour. I mean, if you've never been to a place like that, it's really worth going, because you cannot believe how crazy it is until you're there. It's the kind of place where people say, the globalists are trying to kill you off with the vaccines, and they're going to get aliens to take your place, and don't let them microchip you, and it's all every imaginable conspiracy is in these spaces. Very QAnon, also very a lot of people have like certain like Bible passages that are very meaningful to QAnon on their T-shirts or on their clothing. So there's a lot of sanctimony. There's a lot of God and Jesus stuff, but it's also very militarized. There's a lot of people wearing sort of like militia regalia. One of the ones I went to, there was a whole group of women raising money for the January 6ers, they called it the DC Gulag, and they were claiming that this was just political persecution. They couldn't seem to get their story straight. Some said that was Antifa who did it. Others said the FBI did it. And others say our people did it, but they're being persecuted unfairly because they're just patriots. And they all believe the 2020 election was stolen. So, there's no need for consistency in all of these conspiracies. The conspiracies run up against one another. But mainly, this is about disorienting people. It's Steve Bannon, who's, as you know, one of Trump's closest allies, flooding the zone with, and then he used the S word.
Shit, you could say it on the podcast. It's all right.
Really?
Flood the zone with shit. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's all right.
So it just confuses people.
Yeah.
And
so they take elements of, tiny elements that could be true. Like the FBI did have, I don't know if they're agents or they were just people monitoring what was going on there that were inside the building, also mingling among the rioters. Then when that came out later, it was like, so it's like a false flag operation or a setup where they kind of tricked these people into, storming the Capitol and all that. I don't think that ever panned out, although...
you should look at some of the, the documentaries about it, and you can see that there are militia groups that actually really kind of led a lot of...
Yes. Oh, yeah. No, I know the Proud Boys and who was the other one? In any case. By the way, do you happen to know what it is we were watching when Tucker and Hannity were both showing clips of people just being escorted by police through the Capitol that day, like just taking pictures, and they're showing this going, you see, it's totally peaceful. And I'm just sitting, what am I looking at? What is this?
I have no idea, but it could be that they were just trying to keep them from, smearing feces on the walls, which other people did. Do you know what I mean? There was just so much marauding. They were threatening to murder elected
there
officials.
was that one guard who led the crowd away from where Congress was meeting, and down, up a stairwell and down another hallway just to get him out of the way. Yeah, it could be something like
They're
that.
trying to mitigate the damage,
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
just like, I mean, can you imagine being in a situation like that, or maybe trying to keep them away from places where people, where elected officials were hiding and trying to avoid being murdered?
Okay, one of the parts I liked about your one of the parts I liked about your book was your boots on the ground. You're in these conferences talking to these people. And, when I was writing my conspiracy book, I also wondered how many of them really believe this stuff. Maybe, so your book is divided into kind of three type of people: the thinkers, the funders, and then the kind of shock troops, the rank and file. Maybe the rank and file believe it, sort of, or what does it mean when they believe it? Like the Pizzagate thing. Do you really think Hillary's running a pedophile ring in the basement of a pizzeria? I mean, really? Now, maybe some people would say, I don't know about that particular one, but it's the kind of thing those Democrats would do, or it's the kind of thing the Clintons would do. So, yeah, I'll just tick the box to a survey taker. Yeah, I think that could be true. They don't really believe it. I don't know. What is your sense about, to what extent people actually believe this stuff?
I think you have a range of folks, but, if you're being told in your networks, I mean, part of the disinformation bubbles is really to separate people from the facts. And that just makes them easier to control. And of course, they're inculcating in people fear. They are coming for you in your homes. They are going to control every dollar that you own. They're going to change your gender against your will. And that makes people very reactive. It also, frankly, distracts them from the absolutely, I would say, heroic levels of corruption that this movement is laying the ground for. I mean, one case in point is Elon Musk, who is the legitimate subject of many investigations for his various dealings. He's now in a position to secure favored deals for himself and, of course, continue to receive taxpayer subsidies and privileged contracts. But, of course, Trump and his family, too, have been moving with lightning speed to cash in. So, meme coins is just the least of it in a way.
The meme coin, but that's not a government program. That's his own business, right?
What this movement is ushering in is a kind of a regime that is destroying our overseas alliances that we've had for 80 years. It has provided a certain measure of post-war stability, including nuclear non-proliferation. Has it been perfect? No. But, we also have to acknowledge that, power hates a vacuum. And, there's been a certain measure of post-war peace and stability in some regards. But also, the kleptocracy that they're laying the ground for. And so, if you get people sort of wrapped up in these conspiracies, they're not paying attention to the bigger picture. And that's what I think the most disturbing legacy of this of the period that we're seeing is the separation of many people from the facts. Listen, I don't dislike all the people I met. I met some really lovely people. They love their families. They care about their communities. They truly think that what they're doing is best for America. They truly do believe that they're facing an absolute apocalypse. Some of them say it's like an apocalypse that's demonic, or they say it's just, everybody to the left of them, including rhinos, is a woke communist or whatever. But they really do think they're doing what's best for the country. But all of their good efforts are being harnessed in service of an agenda that is frankly destroying our democracy, destroying the prosperity that we've enjoyed, collectively, destroying, the principles of equality and free speech and all those other wonderful things that we've actually been able to enjoy in our country.
Yeah. Now, your subtitle of Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, that's not what they think they're doing. They think the libs are destroying democracy. And you can hear this every night on Fox and these other shows. I toggle back and forth just for fun to see what everybody's saying about current events. And it's like watching two different planets. But of course, they're standing up there. What do they think they're doing? They're saving America. They're not, it's the libtards that are trying to take your freedoms away and so on.
Well, they do, but here the folks, I describe this sort of religious right and the new right as the power couple of American authoritarianism, and the new right is, I would say, overall explicitly less religious nationalist, but more explicitly anti-democratic. And many of them say democracy simply doesn't work. It's not workable anymore, and we need a more monarchical form of government. Who Curtis Yarvin is. He's been a big inspiration for some of the folks on the new right. And he, basically advocates for a Red Caesar, right? A guy who's going to crack heads and break the rules as long as the heads he's cracking belong to their political enemies. And they're always attacking woke elites. But here's the thing. Most of them got Ivy League degrees, number one. And number two, they really want to be a new elite. It's not like they're against elites per se. They're fine, telling the little people whatever they need to hear to get on board. But they really want to be a new elite. They want the power and the wealth for themselves and for
How would you describe these new right people in contrast with, say, Reagan and Bush, W, I don't know, Mitt Romney, the other candidate, what's his name, ran against Obama. I'm sorry, I'm blanking out. You know who I mean? Anyway, yeah, those kind of conservatives.
Well, I don't think they're remotely conservative. I see them as radicals. A true conservative would respect and seek to preserve the institutions of value that have served us over time. They would want to preserve they prize the integrity of the judiciary. They would want to, preserve laws that have been used to sort of guide leadership over time. They would want to improve public education rather than just smash it and destroy it. They would want to, conserve what's good rather than having this idea. I think these new right people are I think of them as like reactionary nihilists. And when I say nihilists, I mean that they think that there's, by their actions more than by their words, they believe there's no value in the world as it exists. They believe there's no value in our democracy as it exists, and they want to smash it up and create something new. But what they want to create is a kind of imaginary version of a kind of American past that never actually existed the way that they say it did, and also one that includes a lot of regressive elements like a very strict gender order, a kind of almost like the ability to have a feeding frenzy at the very top, where the the leader and his allies can sort of profit enormously from this arrangement, and the ordinary folk are sort of kept in line with the religious nationalism piece of it. I think the simplest way to see, look at them in a way is to see them as an updated version of early 20th century fascism. Their main intellectual resources come from that period. Again, they, think we're in a state of emergency. The folk need a strong man who is above the law in order to save themselves from the forces of liberalism and equality. They're profoundly misogynist. They tap into all kinds of prejudice. And they believe, as a matter of intellectual conviction, that politics is the art of lying and domination and deceit. So they, eagerly participate in the spreading of disinformation and reserve a kind of esoteric truth for themselves and their small clique of what they hope is going to be a new elite.
Again, how many of them actually believe this? Like, for example, women shouldn't be voting. I mean, come on. I mean, that's never going to happen. You'd have to have 2/3 of the states to pass a new constitutional amendment. That's not going to happen, right? Half the country are female. They're not going to give up the vote. So what are we really talking about here? That it's just a handful of these people, and the rest are quiet. They don't stand up to them.
Those folks who are articulating those ideas are more and more. There are more and more of them, and they're being elevated within the movement. Like, look at Doug Wilson. He He speaks at NatCon conferences now. Doug Wilson is a pastor from Moscow, Idaho. When I say he's a pastor, it doesn't really explain this sort of sprawling religious empire that he runs. Pete Hegseth attended a church that was affiliated with his religious network. And, those kinds of voices are being louder. Now, are they going to outright say women can't vote? Well, it might be done in different ways. So, for instance, are you familiar with the SAVE Act?
No, what is that?
Oh, look it up. It's interesting. It's an act that would say that in order to vote, the excuse for this is we need to stop voter fraud because this is a big thing about the movement. So if you have a name on your birth certificate and a different name when you go to vote, you have to have, a real ID or like a certain kind of ID to prove that you are who you say you are, which is often a passport. Well, a lot of Americans, many millions of Americans don't have passports. And most American women change their names when they get married. And they said specifically, a marriage certificate is not sufficient proof that you are who you say you are. So you could show up with your birth certificate and say, my name is Katie Jones, but here I changed my name to Katie Smith. Here it's on my marriage certificate. They say, not good enough, lady. You have to have a passport or some other form of like real ID. And, driver's license doesn't cut it. So this would actually kick tens of millions of women off the voter rolls. Here's another thing we're hearing more and more about the movement, head of household voting. And this idea is being normalized within the movement. The idea is that the head of the household, who is presumably a man, gets to decide how everyone in the household votes. And why? Why is that? Well, it'll promote familial harmony. That's like, really? So there are different ways to chip away at a right to vote before you actually go whole hog. I mean, look what they did with other types of reproductive rights. And by the way, it's not just, anybody who thinks that they're satisfied leaving abortion rights to the states really needs to just take another look at what's going on. They're not only preparing to trying to criminalize medication that ends pregnancy in its earliest days or weeks, but they're calling it chemical abortion. But they're also trying to criminalize certain forms of birth control that they choose to characterize as abortion, such as certain forms of pills and also certain forms of IUDs and things like that. I mean, this is a movement that's just getting started for many years. Listen, when I started writing about this stuff 16 years ago, people were like, what are you talking about? Obama's the president. The big story in religion reporting was the rise of the nuns, remember? But you can see how strategic this movement is, how much money is behind it. And this sort of speaks to the money part of it, which I'd love to get into if you have time.
Yeah, we'll do that in a second.
Yeah.
John McCain is the guy. Sorry for my senior brain there. I used to do a weekly bike ride past a Planned Parenthood, and I would periodically pull over and chat with the protesters out there every day. And after the Supreme Court decision, I rolled up and said, so you guys won. You're done. You don't have to come here anymore, right? She goes, oh, no. We are just getting started. Like, Oh, I thought you said it was a states' right thing. Yep, that's right. And we're going to fight it here in California. Oh, I see.
Yeah,
okay.
there have been so many bills introduced to chip away. And, we might have talked about this, Michael, but this is very personal for me because between my kids, we were trying to have another one, and I started to miscarry. I was pregnant, started to miscarry, landed in a Catholic hospital because I was bleeding out. They delayed miscarriage care for hours until I had lost 40% of my blood and was on the verge of dying.
Ugh.
And it was only when I was going into shock and it was clear that I was going to die that I received the abortion that saved my life. These stories are happening all over the country. Women are actually dying or being so damaged that they have organ failure or, become like disabled or have to go to a long-term care facility. And you can't take away the right to abortion without making all pregnancy unsafe. because something like 20% of all known pregnancies end in miscarriage, and a significant number of those require intervention. And we're getting these tragic stories all over the country. My story, I mean, it was probably the worst day of my life because I was begging people to treat me and in this Catholic setting, and no one would, because Catholic hospitals don't do abortions, even if you're just miscarrying.
What state were you in?
I was in New York City.
Huh.
Yeah, I know it's really shocking. I was in the West Village in St. Vincent's Hospital.
What?
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really horrible, but like, you know, so many stories are worse than mine. You know?
Right. Okay, let's talk about the money and these groups. Let me cue this up for you here because I got to thinking about this and looked a few things up. So you talk about like Ralph Reed's Faith and Freedom Coalition, the Freedom Research Councils, Watchmen on the Wall, and Faith Wins organizations, Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA and his CPAC. You know, there's dozens of these, Seven Mountains Mandate. Well, anyway, there's a whole laundry list of these groups, many of which you went to and talked to. So just for fun, I just Googled left-wing think tanks, and I mean, there's just as many of them. And right, I mean, there's Open Society Foundation, Move On, Millennium Promise, New America, European Movement UK, Scientists for EU, Center for American Progress, the Aspen Institute, the Urban Institute, Freedom House, no, yeah, maybe, I don't know, Economic Policy Institute, the ACLU, Brookings Institute, I don't know, I think they're more centrist. But a bunch of these were funded by George Soros. Okay, I'm teeing this up for you because conservatives listening to this would say, this is the way the game is played. You guys do it. Here's your list of groups. Here's our list of groups. You have your billionaires like George Soros. We have our guys. That's the American democracy. What's the difference?
Sure. The big difference is that money on the right, there's a lot of money on the right. There's a lot of money on the left, although I would argue the amounts of money spent on the right are greater, like the amounts are greater, but they're spent differently. So on the sort of, when I say left, I mean sort of moderate, liberal, left, progressive, whatever, that sort of big tent, big, noisy, sort of undisciplined tent. The money is spent on often technocratic solutions, or it's spent on organizations that are operating in silo. They're not sort of networked with other organizations, and they're also not functioning as giant voter turnout machines. They're not all getting the rank and file to vote on a single issue or a handful of issues. Like, you just don't see the kinds of voter guides distributed through churches on the left. I mean, you see some, but the churches certainly don't have, like, there's a lot of progressive politics in America, but those churches, first of all, they're graying, you know, and they're sort of thinning out. And they also don't have the money funding them, and they don't have the organizational capacity, whereas the right is much more disciplined. You know, the right people don't just invest in technocratic solutions. They invest in infrastructure and they invest in people. So they're really good at leadership development. I'm not saying that you can't do these things. I mean, in some instances, they're using the tools of democracy to dismantle democracy. I write about it to show how it's done. You know, it's like, if you can, you know, somebody described my last book. He said, if it's a watch, you like take the back off the watch so you can sort of see how it all works. And that's why I covered the infrastructure of this movement, to show how they're able to punch above their political weight, to show how they're able to get the rank and file to vote against their own economic self-interest.
And we're talking billions of dollars here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, many billions. I mean, we're talking Barry Side with his $1.6 billion donation to form the Marble Freedom Trust, and putting Leonard Leo, who is the head of the built up the Federalist Society to where it is today, putting him in charge of it. It's Bradley, which also has 1-something billion in assets. It's the National Christian Foundation, which also distributes like hundreds of millions, or I believe it might have been like up to 1.1 or 1.5 billion over the last couple of years. I mean, the amounts of money are absolutely massive. You know, in Money, Lies, and God, I pay very close attention to this group that I call the funders. These people are the beneficiaries of the massive concentrations of wealth over the past decades. And they're investing their fortunes, or at least a portion of them, in anti-democratic projects. And by the way, religiously, they're all over the place. I'm thinking about the Corkeries or Barry Side or Tim Dunn or the DeVos Prince family juggernaut. I mean, some are evangelical, some are Protestant, some are Catholic, some are Jewish, some are frankly atheistic. But what they really want is economic policies that are going to benefit them. They want, I would say, justification for their extreme concentrations of wealth, and they want to be able to make more money. They understand, I think, to some degree, that their extreme wealth comes at there's a social cost to it. We have a sort of now winner takes all kind of economy, and it's making life harder for people, the ordinary families. But they need to get the rank and file on board, so they invest in part in these disinformation projects, and they invest in the culture wars, because the culture wars are just very distracting, and they get people to not think about what's really going to sort of help them economically. I mean, there's a lot that this movement offers the rank and file: sense of community, a sense of pride in being American, a sense of belonging, and all of that. It's very focused on identity politics. They accuse the left of playing identity politics. I think they play it harder. But at the end of the day, you think that a funder like Elon Musk cares about religion? Absolutely not. I mean, he just sees that stuff as the price of doing business, so he can get his privileged contracts and expand his business and be on his way to becoming a trillionaire.
Yeah, I don't know Elon personally, but I've watched endless hours of him on Rogan and other shows. He doesn't come off like that at all. That's not what he's doing. He already has all the money he needs, more money he can ever use. Why is he doing that? Well, he said, because Joe asked him, why are you doing this? You don't need the money. He doesn't need more contracts and so on. He's doing it to save America, because he's worried about what the left has done to destroy free speech and the whole censorship thing and the whole crazy woke, far left progressive DEI, anti-racism, all this stuff that, a lot of people are not, even centrists or even a lot of old school liberals are not happy with. And that's what he says that's why he's doing it.
And what they're really doing is declaring a total war on anti-discrimination law. I mean, there's DEI programs that were overreach, or that, was there some silly stuff? Of course there was, but they're not doing it to improve that. They're also not sort of acknowledging at all the conditions under which some of these programs arose, where you had rank discrimination against women and people of color. They're really doing it to declare war on anti-discrimination law. I mean, a lot of this is going to end up functioning as, I hate to say it, an affirmative action program for white conservative men. I mean, just look at Pete Hegseth. Is he really the most qualified guy for the job?
None of these people that are appointed were the most qualified.
Yeah,
including Tulsi Gabbard, so a woman, whatever. But again, how do you know that's what Elon is really up to? Because he says that's not what he's up to. So how do you know?
I don't know what's in people's hearts, but I will say this. A lot of extremely rich people, and I've spent enough time in Santa Barbara to know a few, live in, I would say, like islands, right? Or they're living in these very privileged islands where everybody around them is super nice to them and sort of super obsequious, et cetera. And they know that they're a lot of them, derive their wealth from monopolistic businesses. And at the same time, life is getting harder for a lot of Americans. You got two parents, you got three jobs, and you still can't afford a house or a dignified life for yourself and your kids. And so we don't have a problem with not enough wealth in America, but we've, just don't take my word for it. Look at the economic data. You see a sort of ballooning at the super tippy top, and then you see a sort of thinning out in the bottom, I would say 90% perhaps. So they can sort of hear from far away over the walls of their islands of privilege, the voices of their critics saying, well, maybe you should pay your taxes. Maybe you should pay at least as much taxes as a public school teacher. They feel really defensive about this. And so they get really fixated on this sort of anti-woke stuff because it's almost like a kind of thin cover for otherizing other groups of people. And they, and so then they, get all in on this thing. I mean, the whole woke thing is kind of a massive distraction. I'm not particularly woke, but I'm also more anti-woke than woke because I see anti-wokeism as a tool of an authoritarian movement. I see it as a means of distraction. It confuses people so that they align their politics in an anti-democratic direction. So I'll give you an example. In this last election, there are huge numbers of people who were voting on the issue of whether transgender female athletes should play in women's sports.
Yeah.
Now, a huge number of people voting on this. But there are so many issues facing the American people. And if you can get people to vote on this shiny bauble, right, which is, frankly, I'm against it in many circumstances, so I think there's some complexity depending on the ages, the people, the sport, et cetera. But it's not a big issue at all compared with the other issues that we're facing. We're looking at an administration that is aggressively destroying the planet, rolling back every policy achievement, turning the Department of Justice into a personal mob boss service. We're seeing the destruction of global alliances. And you're telling me that the 10 NCAA athletes or whatever among the 500,000 NCAA athletes is the issue we should be focusing on? I don't know the exact number, but the head of the NCAA.
It's close. I've looked it all up. It's close to that. Yeah, it's not the numbers or the percentage, which is minuscule. It's the individual stories. So when you see somebody like Riley Gaines, usually on Fox News, talking about this stuff, but did this not happen? I assume she didn't make this story up. There's, Will Thomas, standing next to her in the locker room, staring at her, getting dressed naked, putting on her swimsuit, and he's there all fully intact male. Come on, that's not right.
I think these people should be asked, in the end of the day, did their anti-woke crusade in the end make them fellow travelers with a fascist movement? Do you think the secular left center, the anti-woke left, became so distracted by these anti-woke issues that it became a useful ally for the right?
Maybe.
Because it allowed people to...
Of course, they don't think that's what they're doing. Right? They don't want to do that. But
these are not issues these kinds of issues can be adjudicated by sports authorities and doctors, and it's a relatively new thing. And frankly, it could be done without regard to politics. But listen, I think the Trump administration has done everything conceivable to make everyone scared of DEI so that everyone is now going overboard. Is that going to be honestly meritocratic now that we know it's less possible for women and people of color to be hired, even if they're the best people for the job? It's, I have a friend who works in the federal government who was told, send an email. If you suspect anyone in your division is using DEI in their hiring, here's a place you can call. And this person said, it's very alarming because the federal workplaces are like any other workplaces. There are people who hate you and people who like you, right? Some people are competitive. And what it's going to mean is if I hire a woman or a person of color, even if they're the best person in the job, someone who might not like me is going to say, oh, she's using DEI, right? And what that means is, well, I better not hire a woman or a person of color. I better hire a white man and better be conservative so that I can't be accused of being DEI or employing DEI. It's going to basically make it very difficult, much more difficult it's going to bring back discrimination. And then there will be no recourse for discrimination.
Well, but the laws, the 1964, laws that Johnson passed are still on the books. Those aren't going away. You can't discriminate against people.
In this new administration.
Yeah. Well, I've been kind of outspoken against a lot of this stuff because, it's very divisive. That is to say, to constantly get people to focus on other people's skin color.
But who is doing that? I mean, it's the right who's
the left is doing that. That's all you hear from the left.
I don't know what you're looking at or what kind of media you're consuming, but that's not my world at all.
Really? I get I consume as much as I possibly can across the spectrum.
Is this stuff you're seeing online? Because the right pushes this stuff online. So, for example, at America Fest, I was just there in December. Every other person spoke about the issue of transgender women playing in women's sports. Nobody spoke about the fact that gun violence is the number one cause of child and adolescent death in our country. No one spoke about the fact that 16% of American children are impoverished and struggle to eat. Nobody spoke about the fact that we have a scandal of child abuse in our country. No, instead, it's focused on this tiny little, like a laser pointer cat toy, Michael.
Yes.
We need to move away from this stuff. They're the ones who are pushing it all the time to get folks who are susceptible to it to focus on that to the exclusion of every other problem in our country. The fact that too many families can't support themselves. They can't, like the bread and butter issues that affect so many American families. And instead, we're all going to be focused on this little tiny side issue over there.
Well, that was the analogy I used when the left media went crazy over Elon's supposed Sieg Heil hand wave. I thought that is the dumbest thing to waste time on, because meanwhile, it's almost like Trump sent him out there. Go out there and do something crazy because I'm about to issue a bunch of executive orders here. And the entire left media will just talk about you giving a Sieg Heil for days. And that's exactly what happened. That's not the right media. That's the left media.
Well, here's the thing. These people are essentially attention seekers. And they figured out that this is a low-cost, easy hit for a round of media attention. It's low cost or even profitable for them, and that they're confident their supporters will not view this as a genuine Hitler salute, even if they are indeed tapping into anti-Semitism and racism. It's with a wink and a nod they're tapping into it, but oh no, I'm not a Nazi. So they're confident that their supporters are going to see this as another exercise of owning the libs, and the libs are going to oblige by complaining about their performance. But combining this with religious rhetoric, frankly, shows quite clearly what religion has become for these people. They are power worshipers. They worship power. Their religion is one of extreme intolerance and a desire to make others unhappy and to exact vengeance.
Yeah. I don't know how much you follow Bill Maher, but he's on this almost every week. He's an old school Democrat liberal. His whole life, that's all he's ever voted. And he complains constantly about his own party, obsessing, again, about DEI and trans and this and that. And he thinks it's a terrible idea. It's ruined the party, cost you guys the election, he says to his fellow Democrats. This is not cool. Stop it, drop it, course correct now, or else we're going to lose the midterms. We're going to lose 2028. What do you think about that?
Well, I want to ask you a question. I mean, do you think that with his obsession, do you think that he is actually, by buying into the trap that they're setting for him, do you think that he's, helping to drive a certain number of voters into supporting fascism and authoritarianism? I mean, you're not really acknowledging what's happening in front of our eyes, Michael, to our democracy, to our institutions, to our overseas alliances.
Yeah, he doesn't think that's what he's doing. But, there's enough examples, again, even if it's a small number, like the, what do they call it? The drag queen story hour at the public school. This has happened. Maybe it's a small number, but why is that happening? And why does the media cover that? And then, the left praises it. Oh, this is a wonderful thing. No, it's not.
What do you mean when you say the left? I mean, where are you finding your stuff? Are you just like looking at libs of TikTok stuff?
Okay.
On Twitter?
Again, just, Bill Maher is...
I mean, do you see it in your own life? I see a lot of poor people in my life. I know people who have lost their children due to gun violence. I think we have real problems in our country, and we need to, when the right starts harping on this stuff, whatever you think of those issues, you need to say, listen, we need some policies and we need politicians to do that as well. As, The Democratic Party made mistakes, for sure. On the other hand, they weren't really focused on this issue. It's the right that talks about this stuff constantly, turning a molehill into a mountain.
That does happen. Do I see this in my own life? No.
I think it's private schools that have more of a problem with whatever wokeism that people are talking about than the public schools, which are really focused on, getting kids, often from modest families, the skills they need to succeed in a modern economy.
Like a lot of this stuff comes to me on Twitter. I'm not on Instagram or TikTok or any of those. But on Twitter, I mean, since you mentioned libs of TikTok, they just post videos made by liberals, by these, the blue-haired, nose-ring, crazy, googly-eyed, ranting, screaming people every day, every hour. What am I looking at?
You're looking at libs of TikTok, and you're just falling right into their trap, Michael.
What trap? But the videos are real, right? They're not fake videos. What am I looking at then?
There's all kinds of nutty stuff, but we got to have priorities, man.
Well, agreed. Okay, so gun violence and poverty, yes, way more important.
Videos of people sticking their heads into alligator mouths, but they're crazy. But is that really the biggest problem facing our country?
No, certainly the gun violence thing, but even there.
Look what's happening. You got to read the headlines, honey. Just read the New York Times.
I do. I have the New York. I have the browser open right here. New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Next to them, you'll be glad the Wall Street Journal's pretty critical of Trump so far. But even say the gun violence thing. So conservative media will say, Black Lives Matter. Why don't the people promoting Black Lives Matter care about all the black kids being shot?
I'm not familiar with Black Lives Matter.
Defund the police, all that
what
stuff.
They do or they don't do, but gun violence is now the number one cause of child and adolescent deaths in this country. And it's an absolute disgrace. This doesn't happen in any other country. Most Americans support some form of gun control.
Yeah.
Even people who are gun owners and responsible, gun owners support some forms of gun control. But we have a gun lobby that restricts us from actually being able to take certain kinds of statistics on this. The lobby appears to have bought and paid for the entire Republican Party. People are tired of thoughts and prayers. We got some real problems in our country. And I think we need to be focused on those. And right would like us to get distracted with these shiny baubles of the culture wars, because that's how they manipulate the rank and file into voting for an anti-democratic project.
Who are the Jewish devotees for Ayn Rand?
As you're reading about somebody...
just from bullet points from your book.
I think that referred to Barry Side.
Oh, okay. Yeah, who is he? Talk about him for a little bit.
Barry Side
This is not just religious, right? Some of these are atheists.
No, he's a Chicago billionaire. It's hard to know exactly what his ideology is, although you might find a little bit of a clue in his the names under which he goes by sometimes. But he donated $1.6 billion. He's very sort of quiet in public, but he donated $1.6 billion to form the Marble Freedom Trust, and he put Leonard Leo in charge of it. Leonard Leo has this kind of longtime money man of the right. He built up the Federalist Society to where it is today. He also managed money, raised and spent money on a variety of right-wing legal organizations that sort of like a constellation of right-wing legal organizations that are on that right. And, years ago, Leonard Leo realized that the policies he wanted I think some of these leaders are, frankly, just really all about money and power, and others are more genuinely religious. And I think the two things can be true at the same time. And I think for Leo, those two things are true at the same time. He thinks, he hates abortion, so he wants to end all abortion. He, wants to, probably is very much against same-sex marriage and the like. All the stuff that he thinks is destroying the family. So he realized these kinds of policies were not going to be popular if they were put to the vote. So he thought, well, if we can take the courts, we can get the country, So he set about doing that. And he is, one of the people responsible for the Supreme Court that we have today, where we have a Supreme Court that's sort of very, very hard right overall. And their decisions are not just endorsing the sort of culture war issues that your friend Bill Maher is obsessed with, but also right-wing economic issues that are actually, degrading life for the majority of American families.
Okay, when a Republican president has an opportunity to nominate a Supreme Court justice, they turn to the Federalist Society, who says, here's our list. These are the top 10. We've been tracking them for 30 years. That's Leonard Leo.
Mm-hmm.
Who does Obama go to? Who comes to Obama and says, hey, you got a chance? Here's our list. Is there a group? Is there a billionaire that says, we're going to help you shape the Supreme Court? And if not, why not?
Good question. I mean, there are legal groups like the American Constitution Society, but they don't function in the same way. They don't have anywhere near the kind of money. I mean, again, the right and the left have spent their money differently. The right has invested in infrastructure. Listen, this is a movement that existed for many years, really outside of the Republican Party. And I think the Republican Party thought, wow, these folks are kind of extreme, because if you dig into their sort of their ideology, as I do in my books, they are extreme, pretty extreme. So the Republican Party thought they're extreme, but they're not going to go anywhere, so we can make use of them. They're not going to vote for the other party. So they sort of saw them as a reliable slice of votes. But then over the years, with the investment of all this money and infrastructure building in the movement, they have basically taken over the Republican Party. Sidelined all the real conservatives, and the guardrails of that party have fallen away. And so now you have Elon Musk and his teenage Doge crew rampaging through the federal government, and you've got these Republicans cowering, afraid to say anything, because they're not the ones in control.
Right. But again, that's not what they think they're doing. They think the government is too big, and it is. I mean, we're $37 trillion in debt. This can't be good. Can't somebody do something about it? Now, every Republican president since Reagan said they're going to do something about it. No one's ever done anything about it. They all just grow it even bigger. So isn't it good that at least finally somebody is going to try to do it? And, you've seen the laundry list of things that USAID was funding, because they scrolled it on Fox News, $1.5 billion to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in Serbia's workspaces.
Are you getting your news from Fox News?
This is on the whitehouse.gov articles, USAID waste and abuse. And they just have a laundry list. Fox News gets it from the White House, right? I mean, you can read this, you can get this anywhere.
I will tell you something. I want to stop. Is there waste in federal government as there is in the private sector? Of course. Can things be done more efficiently? Yes. Could you cut 5 to 10% of the workforce and some of those jobs don't really matter? Other people will work harder. Of course you can. But if you slash certain agencies too much, it's like a private equity firm coming in and they think they know from the outside that's not familiar with the business, and they just start cutting willy-nilly, including perhaps some of the most talented members of the workforce. At a certain point, things are going to stop working, and we've seen a lot of this kind of, it's like the Keystone Cops taking over, cutting the people who control the nuclear codes and be like, oopsie, we did that. Now we got to go back and find them. Or cutting people working in the safe, the airline safety. So, it's one thing to eliminate waste and fraud. It's another thing to send in a bunch of 19-year-olds or 22-year-olds who don't know the business, who don't know how those agencies work, into, slashing and burning in that sort of way.
Yeah, I guess so. The question would be, what's the rational way to shrink the government? I don't know. I mean, it's so huge, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Maybe it's the wrecking ball approach. But, these examples that they list, are these just made up? $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia.
I don't know where you're getting that, and I can't fact check this in real time.
Yeah.
So
I'll send you the link. It's just whitehouse.gov and USAID waste and abuse.
Information from Trump.
Yeah.
And
we know
he's a liar. So
yeah. Well, yeah. Maybe they just made all these things up, or maybe USA does, 90% good work helping starving kids in Ethiopia from dying.
They did cancel those contracts for kids to get those
Yeah,
meals.
I know. So probably some kids are dying because of that. Right.
I mean, the thing about USAID, there's something, called soft power that America has actually been able to sort of maintain. And, if we cut all that, power hates a vacuum. We want China coming in and having all that soft power, and that soft power which translates into hard power.
Yeah. So how would you assess the Ukraine situation right now? The one argument being, well, if we just pass another aid package and go on for another year, millions more die, waste of time. Putin's never going to just hand over the Crimea. It's never going to happen. So let's try something different. That's the Trump approach. All right. What's your, I don't know if you give much thought to that.
Well, I'm not an expert in that particular conflict, but I will say that if you're trying to negotiate some kind of an agreement and staunch the bleeding, you don't participate in a public bullying, a disgraceful public bullying operation, which is exactly what Trump advance did with Zelensky. I mean, it's the most unstatesmanlike thing I've ever seen. And frankly, it made me ashamed to be an American. Really sad to say. And this is exactly how it's being perceived and depicted overseas,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, the leaders, NATO leaders and leaders in Europe are really saying that you can no longer see the U.S. as a reliable ally. That's very sad.
So when you talk about set out to destroy American democracy, what does that mean exactly? I mean, you're not saying there won't be any more elections. Surely there'll be an election in 2 years. The midterms are less than 2 years away, and Trump will step aside because he has to, and J.D. Vance will run against Gavin Newsom in 2028. Are you saying that's not going to happen?
Authoritarianism, is better understood as something that happens to a political system rather than something that starts off as a full-fledged political program that receives majority support. So, I suggest that the anti-democratic movement is more pathology than program. I mean, is that really it has these separate pieces or interest groups, sometimes working for different aims, sometimes, whose core ideas are sort of more at odds, but that end up reinforcing one another. So they're rowing in the same boat in a sense, but I think the outcome of their collective actions can be unpredictable and lead to consequences that many of the rank and file who are lending the support to the movement really don't anticipate and wouldn't want.
Yeah. Okay, just a couple more on these fun in-person accounts you have in the book. Moms for Liberty, what was that like? And
oh my gosh.
What are they up to there?
Well, Moms for Liberty, as you know, is a group of women who they've been activated by this idea that they're teaching CRT in public schools, which they don't do. I went to their gathering in one of their annual gathering in Philadelphia, and it was every sort of right-wing culture war, hyperbolic thing was being promoted there. And so I talked to this one lady. I'll just give you an example. I talked to this one lady and asked her, how'd you get involved in this group? And she was a sort of anti-abortion activist before, but on a kind of low level. Like she signed some petitions and stuff. But the thing that got her really involved in Moms for Liberty, she said, was she said, I discovered there was a book in our public library that kids had a book in the public school library, and it was the diary of Anne Frank's diary.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, what is it about that book that you thought was inappropriate for kids' public school library? And she said it was the lesbian scene. And I struggled to think of a lesbian scene in Diary of Anne Frank, and because there isn't one. But she'd heard this from another one of these moms groups. They sort of put this outrageous stuff in there. And, what there is like a couple of sentences in this book that's forgettable. It's basically two 13-year-old girls like pledging their friendship to each other. There's no lesbian scene. But they take this little molehill, they turn it into a mountain, and this sent her over the top. Now, here's the thing about this lady. If you were to sort of really talk to her for a while, you would definitely find homophobia. You might find some, unexamined anti-Semitism. But it's an example of how they find this little thing, they blow it out of proportion. It reminds me of something a friend of mine in Santa Barbara actually teaches in the Central Valley, teaches second grade math, teaches math to primary school kids. And he said everything was really great. And all of a sudden, I'm beset by all of these parents. Like they're confronting me. They're like, "You're teaching CRT in our public schools. Why are you teaching CRT?" And he's like, "I'm teaching second grade math. Let me show you the textbooks." And they were so persuaded by Liz of TikTok, or who maybe some of the other people you're following on Twitter, that he was teaching CRT, that they just became incredibly disruptive and hostile. But it shows how this movement finds these little things. Maybe they're teaching something somewhere that might not be cool, but it's, then it's nationalized. All the public schools are doing this terrible thing. And then you get all these crazy moms showing up, or moms and dads disrupting. So there was a lot of that. And, Moms for Liberty was, the whole thing is like, we're protecting the kids from this horrible, immoral order. And then one of the Moms for Liberty and her husband, a guy with very, close connections to the Florida GOP, were discovered to be having three-ways with women, and he was videoing it or something like this. And so they had to sort of...
Well, one of them, the woman said she didn't at some point consent, although she was involved in the three-way for a while, and then something happened and she changed her mind, I guess, and then he didn't honor the change of mind or something like that. Yeah. Just part of the risk of going into that scenario in the first place.
Like from don't say gay and don't say three-way.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. Then on the economic ideology front, there's kind of a streak, since you mentioned Ayn Rand, of libertarianism, Milton Friedman, Austrian School, Chicago School of Economics. Now, those people there's not a religious agenda there. That's more of we just think the free market is a better way to solve most social problems, so we should do that, and more people will become wealthy through, market exchanges and so on.
Right, and they see, their alliance with the religious right folks as just the price of doing business. They're motivated by our desire to advance their interests, protect their privileges. But, we have, that sector. Then there's, of course, another sector of wealthy funders who are more driven by overtly religious and cultural goals. Then we have, high-level activists and thinkers who run the different organizations that make and they make a lot of money by promoting these kinds of ideas. And then there's a whole set of media empires whose business is to spread different kinds of disinformation and culture war outrage for profit. It's like that. All this stuff is deployed. The culture war stuff is deployed for the politics of outrage.
Yeah.
And that really gets a lot of the rank and file on board. You're distracting people with it's all identity stuff. It's all sexuality stuff, isn't it? Or, identity politics. But it's a massive distraction.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the abortion.
It's also a way of, I'm sorry for interrupting. It's also a way of channeling the grievances of the masses of voters who are disproportionately of lower education, but perhaps middle income, many of whom have legitimate grievances. But if you get them to upset about this culture war thing over here, or whatever, Dyer Van Frank, then you get to sort of channel their grievances and hurl them at their political enemies.
So how would you explain Trump's victory this time around over Kamala Harris? if you had to have a pie chart, the wokeism stuff, the moral panic over CRT, economic interests, whatever. I mean, how would you kind of assess that?
Well, I wish I could sort of convey my pie chart in my head. It's like, I won't try and draw it because I'm a terrible artist. But one thing that did happen is that Trump won approximately, if you look at the number of people who are eligible to vote, he won approximately the same percentage of voters as he got the last time in 2020. But there was significant pressed enthusiasm for vote on the Democratic side. And that's what happened. The right is much better at turning out their base and going after low propensity voters. And they really emphasize that on the sort of, when I say left, I'm talking about big tent, moderate, true conservative, liberal, progressive left. They're just there's a lot of focus on trying to sort of reach out to the other side, see if you can flip them. But there's not quite as much emphasis, I think, as there is on the right on the importance of turning out the base. And the way they campaign is really different. So, for instance, they spent a tremendous amount of money on TV ads, but not nearly enough money on relational organizing. Now, at Turning Point USA, I went to this breakout session where a woman was talking about how they campaigned. She said, if the election is in November, don't reach out to, people in your community or your church in September. You got to reach them in March. And it's really about finding trusted voices in the community and relationship building. And if that community is your neighborhood or your faith-based community or whatever your community may be, it's about creating those relationships, talking with people, talking about shared values, which of course are reduced to it's not about, the value of caring for the poor and, helping children live lives free of violence. It's really all about, this trans person over here and this, bad book over there. So they're just better at that.
Yeah. Yeah. Charlie Kirk's, what's the org? Turning Point USA. Yeah. They were really aggressive at getting out the vote. So again, a conservative reading your book may say, well, that's the way it goes. Why don't get your shit together, get out there and recruit more voters. Come on. Too bad.
I do. Listen, I agree with that analysis. We wouldn't want to emulate their most craven tactics, spreading lies and disinformation, inciting political violence and justifying political violence, and certainly not the kind of lawlessness we're seeing in our government today. But we would do well to learn from their strategic resolve.
Yeah. Well, on the abortion issue, they played the long game, right? From Roe in 1973 till just a couple of years ago. Wow. They did it. It took them a long time. Maybe that's the strategy. On that issue, by the way, I always, again, what do people really think? If you talk to a pro-lifer, why are you pro-life? Well, because, the children and, it's murder and it's alive. You're taking a human life and so on. What is your sense of what the real reason is? Okay, I'll just tell you in terms of, I'll flip the tables on myself that, my sense is that there's something else about controlling female sexuality and reproductive choices that has an evolutionary basis to it that begins with, mother's baby, father's maybe, paternity uncertainty, as it's called in the field, and that men have to be more vigilant in mate guarding to make sure they don't end up allocating their limited resources to some other guy's DNA, right? And so this is kind of I'm skipping through the evolutionary psych argument for this, but that ultimately this kind of trickles down to religious prohibitions against homosexuality and infidelity and adultery and so on, but always in the direction of it's women who should not be adulterous and have premarital sex and so on. The guys, they probably shouldn't, but it's not no big penalties in the Old Testament for the guys. And of course, the Old Testament patriarchs had tons of wives and concubines and so on, and lots of babies. And so I do think there's something about that. But of course, nobody who's pro-life says, well, I just like to control female sexuality and choice, right? They don't say that.
It's really interesting. Phyllis Schlafly had a really interesting line in one of her either writings or books, and I don't have it in front of me, but she said, because the women are forced to bear the consequences of the sex act, men must be compelled, she used the word, to care for his children and the woman who bears them. And that was her excuse for why the feminist movement she thought was terrible. It's basically the idea that society is so irredeemably unequal that the only way for women to claw back any kind of security in such a deeply unequal society is to make men do, force men to occupy a certain role. Now, the lucky thing about you and me today, Michael, is that we live in the year 2025. And if we, are advocating the idea of free speech and personal will and the idea that, people shouldn't just be forced to have babies that they can't afford and don't want, then we can have, we have the technology to make this happen. And as Americans, we, are of course guided by the promise that the ideal of equality, at least the ideal of human equality, never perfectly realized, of course, but at least.
But wait, isn't the point you just had from Phyllis Schlafly? Isn't that why we have deadbeat dad laws? Because a lot of these guys, they just take off, and women are left stranded alone, and so you gotta grab his part of his paycheck and do it through the law. Get these guys to own up to their responsibilities. That's that took the government to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, of course, you'd rather do it culturally. Just don't have sex before marriage, or don't have children before marriage. And if you have children, get married and get a job. Just really basic stuff. That's what conservatives claim they're promoting. My question is, why aren't liberals taking credit for that? And yeah,
I mean, I think it's the one party is promoting policies that are actually going to help the American family, and the other one is promoting policies that are impoverishing American families. One party is promoting a policy that helps people have the children that they want and gives them the opportunity to form families with people they want to form families with. I mean, the decision about when to have children or how many is the most intimate and personal decision a family can make. And I don't think the government should be involved in telling people how to do that. And also, I think, as I mentioned earlier, you can't make abortion illegal. Well, you can't take away the right to abortion without taking away, without making all pregnancy unsafe. My story about needing an abortion to save my life is not unique.
No.
You talk to women who've had kids, I mean, I would say probably maybe a third to a half of my friends have had miscarriages.
Mm-hmm.
And a good number of them needed some kind of intervention in order to complete the miscarriage, or had a very troubled pregnancy or a placenta previa or something like this. I mean, unfortunately, we're ending up in a situation where doctors are fleeing red states, maternity doctors, OB/GYNs, because they can't safely practice medicine without fearing that they will be imprisoned and break the law. If they're seeing a woman in distress, if they can't treat her, well, or if they do treat her to save her life or preserve her health. And the stories are coming out. I mean, ProPublica has done a really good job of highlighting a number of them. But for every story we hear, there's so many that don't make the news. Back in 2015, I was hired as an investigator by the ACLU. They were, forget about abortion. They were just looking for, they wanted to mount a case where women had not received the care they needed to complete a miscarriage or treatment that they needed to save their lives, and that had ended up harming them because of anti-abortion legislation. Or no, it wasn't that. It was because of it was in Catholic hospitals specifically, because Catholic hospitals, no matter if you're in a red state or a blue state, they're governed by what they call religious and ethical directives. where they don't do abortions. And what this translates into is what I experienced, which is delayed miscarriage care that almost cost me my life. So I was looking for these other stories. And Michael, I can tell you, I spoke to families of women who died. This is back in 2015. I mean, I'll never forget those stories where, one woman was experiencing a real terrible, problem with her pregnancy. And in order to save her life, had she been given the information she needed, her family's like she never would have chosen to go on bed rest and continue that pregnancy. But because she went in a Catholic hospital, they didn't give her all the information she needed to make that decision. So they kept her on bed rest basically until she died because they weren't going to do an abortion. And, it's just an unbelievable tragedy. That story never made the news because the family was already so traumatized that they didn't want to be subject to the kind of blowback you received. It took me years before I could even share the story that I shared with you today without breaking down.
Wow.
It was the worst day of my life. We shouldn't have to share the stories of the worst days of our lives in order to prove what shouldn't have to be proven, is that maternal care in a modern society should be governed by best practices medicine and not by religious doctrine.
Hard for me to believe that otherwise rational religious people can't see the difference between a clump of 16 cells all the way up to, 3 months or something, and an actual adult human life that's a citizen protected by the Constitution and the laws and so on. I mean, you can say, yes, it's a potential human, and I'll agree to all that. And you're taking, a potential life, it's not a person yet, and so on, and so all those arguments. But, when it comes down to a story like yours, you can't see the difference there? Really? I mean, this is the problem with religion, poisoning reason, otherwise good faculties that these people have in other areas of their life. They just can't get past that. I mean, if you look at, you hear the statistic, we live twice as long as people did, a century ago, or whatever. Not actually really. It's that childbirth deaths for both infants and, and mothers was so high before the 20th century that just getting you through that, just eliminating that, automatically made the average go way up, along with flush toilets and other things, public health, vaccines, and so on. It's not like, everybody just miraculously lives longer now. So another question. We're recording this on the day after the Oscars, and Nora was the big winner. I haven't seen the film, but it's apparently
I haven't seen it, and I don't pay attention. I'm so sorry.
Apparently it's about sex work.
About the Oscars.
Yeah, I know. I can't even watch them anymore. But apparently it's about sex work. So, I've had a bunch of people on this podcast. It's a sort of an ongoing debate in my own head as well. Prostitution versus sex work.
This is not my issue. So
okay.
Maybe not.
You don't have an opinion on this?
About the Oscars. Don't ask me what they wore. Definitely don't ask me what they wore.
No, I was going to ask you about if you have an opinion about sex work for women as an honorable way of empowering versus it should be.
I've written a few books about the rise of the anti-democratic right. Can you just,
that's
talk
enough
about something that I've written about?
Okay. All right. Well, I'm just interested in a lot of different big topics like that. Okay, so you have a list of 7 solutions. Just pick a couple that you think, other than the Democrats getting their act together in terms of getting the vote out. That's a big one.
We need a big tent. We got to stop purity testing one another. We're not going to agree on everything, nor should we in a democracy as diverse as ours. At a lot of the conferences I go to, I started hearing, that speakers paraphrase Reagan when they said, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. And I think we would do well to adhere to that advice if we can agree on some core values, the values of democracy, of equality, of pluralism, of the idea that, we should be able to, we're not going to spread disinformation and conspiracism for politics and power, the idea that we should try and work toward a common good, then I think we can, find ways to work with one another. Organization is another point. Organization really matters. I think investing in a sort of infrastructure of a democracy building movement would be a really good idea at this point. It's shocking that that's been so neglected for so long. And finally, I think local activism really matters. If you're not paying attention to what's going on in your school board, guess who shows up? The Moms for Liberty, demanding that your second grade math teacher stop teaching CRT and, raising hell. So you kind of need to be on top of what's happening. And of course, my view is that school books should always be age appropriate. Some content is appropriate for different age groups and not appropriate for others. But, we also need to, be able to push back against lies and disinformation when they're being spread. And one great way to do that, by the way, is volunteer in your kid's public school library, as I did, unpack the books. And, right now, a lot of the public school libraries are being accused of promoting CRT just because they have books by Black authors, not promoting CRT. I mean, it's really very sad. Some teachers are being, afraid to actually teach about real aspects of American history because all of that has been so weaponized and politicized. So you need to really get involved. And by the way, those public school libraries also have right-wing books. I unpacked a book by Callista Gingrich.
Oh,
put it on the shelf.
Newt's wife, right?
Maybe next one anti-bullying book. I don't know, but the library does.
Yeah.
Local activism is really important. I think that, it's really, there are things we can do as individuals, like vote, encourage our friends and family and people in our community to vote. But there are things we can only really do when we join together with others. And I think that, if you're feeling a sense of hopelessness or despair about what's happening in the national political theater, get involved and meet others, like figure out what your interests are and what your lane is and get involved. And that will sort of take away, I think, that despair. And it's actually kind of energizing and fun.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you so much for hosting me.
Here we go. Money, Lies, and God. There it is. Get it in audio if you like. What are you working on next? You must be, you're always writing another article or investigative piece for somebody.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty busy.
The book,
doing, this book just launched last week. So I'm pretty busy with that. But, I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to the folks who listen in. And, it's fun to have these kinds of challenging conversations. So thanks very much.
Yeah, I mean, it's just crazy times. I mean, it's hard to even be away from the news for more than a couple hours. It's like, oh my God, what happened today?
I know.